And perhaps Gareth could, when he does join us, he can identify himself.
Right, can I unmute?
Yeah, so whoever's participating in the panel, if you could keep your microphones on, everyone else, if you could mute your microphones, I'd be grateful. Thank you. Well, this is a Global Perspectives Forum. It's a panel discussion this week on Iran, Israel, and the US, trends in relations and threats to regional stability. We have, or the Global Perspective Forum usually has a weekly meeting, and we tend to adopt Chatham House rules, and we tend not to record those meetings, so it allows for a free flow of conversation. However, this week will be different. Chatham House rules do not apply, and the meeting will be recorded. So for those who usually attend, please take note, it's not the normal format. We're very, very lucky this week to have the following very eminent guests speaking from positions of knowledge and experience on this particular subject. We have Paul Pillar. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University, and he's at the Brookings Institute. He served in several senior positions with the CIA and the National Intelligence Council over a 30-year span. Sorry, again. We will, in due course, I'm told, have Gareth Porter, a historian based in the US. He's an investigative journalist, author, and policy analyst specializing in US national security issues. We have Mohammed, or Professor Mohammed Sahimi. He's a professor of chemical engineering and material sciences and holds an NIOC chairman in petroleum engineering at the University of Southern California. He's also active in journalism and writes frequently on Iranian politics. And finally, we have Richard Silverstein. He is runs the Tikkun Olam blog, devoted to exposing the excesses of Israel's national security state. His work has appeared in Haaretz and in the Forward, Seattle Times, and the Los Angeles Times. On top of this, he contributes to a number of essays that are well published. Thank you, gentlemen, all for joining. It is a topical discussion. We had a discussion around setting something like this up some time ago. Iran has very much been in the forefront of the news and in international affairs since certainly since 2019, particularly to do with the JCPOA. And given that that's where we sort of start, I'd be grateful if Richard Silverstein could come forward and give us a little brief background about the JCPOA, its inception, and then its tearing down. If we could kick things off with that. Richard, the floor is yours.
Sure. Sure. So the JCPOA is an agreement that was negotiated between several European states, the Obama administration, Russia and China, I believe, also were involved. And it was an agreement that would constrict the nuclear program of Iran. So because the West was fearing that Iran was, and this is up for debate about what Iran's ultimate intentions were, but the fear was that Iran was moving towards a nuclear weapons capability, and the goal was to try to delay that eventuality. And so the Obama administration went through a long period of negotiation with Iran and the other powers, and they came to this agreement. And according to the measures that were announced then, it would have pushed back the nuclear threshold by, I think, 10 to 15 years. And as soon as Trump came to power, he wanted to abrogate U.S. Participation in it. And I think after about a year of the Trump administration, he did back out of JCPOA. And that, in turn, started a whole concatenation of events by which the European signatories tried to save the deal Trump did his best by imposing draconian additional sanctions to what already were in place to show his hostility towards Iran and his derision for the agreement itself. And the Iranians were left really kind of, in a way, holding the bag, because the European states tried but failed to create economic pathways that would ease the sanctions. And the Europeans were trying to act as if JCPOA, as far as they were concerned, was still in effect, but the U.S. Provisions and sanctions were really blocking them from providing any sort of relief to Iran. So one thing I think we're going to get into later is that Iran has now turned to China and has basically either turned its back entirely on the Europeans and certainly on the Americans, or at least it's moving away from that direction and towards China. And there's been an agreement to create a $400 billion investment pool whereby China would not only invest in infrastructure in Iran, but also there would be close military cooperation. I presume maybe there would be arms sales as well from China to Iran. And that's really a huge undertaking. It's somewhat controversial, and Professor Sahimi can talk about this, I'm sure, inside Iran, because there's jockeying going on between moderates and hardliners. And the hardliners are itching to take control of the presidency in the next election and are looking to discredit the moderates that have been involved in negotiating this deal with China. So we're not sure exactly what direction this is going in, but it clearly seems that China has vastly increased its leverage in relations with Iran, and it seems like the U.S. and Europeans have vastly decreased their leverage and the role, the constructive role, if they wanted to play any, that they could play in this. If I've left anything important out, I hope the other panelists will add to this.
Yes, I'm very grateful for that. In terms of the JCPOA, you spoke about the inception of that particular agreement, putting back Iran's nuclear capability back by 15 years. So there was maybe some disagreement around whether that's what it would actually achieve, and perhaps that's why the current administration decided to try and scrap that. But what is the answer to that criticism of the JCPOA, if I may ask any member of the panelists who feels happy to take that on?
Well, I think it should be pointed out that the Trump administration was determined from the outset to destroy this agreement. This was probably the most significant foreign policy achievement that the Obama administration had, kind of the foreign policy equivalent to the Affordable Care Act, the Health Care Act, which was the principal domestic achievement of the administration. And as Mr. Trump has demonstrated repeatedly, if he's got any consistent principle he follows at all in determining policy, is to do the opposite of whatever Obama did. And that, along with some other reasons, made it clear, even from the outset, that this administration was not going to subscribe to the JCPOA. Just to fill in a little more of the detail beyond what Richard relayed, it was in May of 2018, a little over a year into the administration, that Trump renounced the agreement. Iran, despite that, continued to adhere to its obligations regarding the nuclear limits for another year, until about May of last year, when the Trump administration escalated the confrontation even more, and basically has been since then been waging unlimited economic warfare, not just with the reimposition of sanctions that were relieved by the JCPOA, but piling on as many other sanctions and every other way that they can try to cripple the Iranian economy. Since then, that is to say, since spring of last year, Iran has responded to the maximum pressure campaign with some of its own counter pressure. On the nuclear side, it has taken several incremental steps to go beyond the JCPOA limits. This involves producing more low-enriched uranium than they had been limited to and spinning a few more centrifuges. They've also upped the percentage of enrichment slightly, so they're enriching up to about 4.5% prior to the previous 3.6. They have made it clear all along, the Iranian regime has, that these are eminently reversible steps, and they are ready to reverse them whenever the United States comes back in compliance with the JCPOA. In terms of criticisms of the agreement, well, of course, we heard many things in the past about the so-called sunset clauses, for example, that some of the limitations would not be in perpetuity. That's probably the main thing that critics have harped on. And to that, it needs to be pointed out, first of all, that some of the most important provisions did not have sunset limits at all. The basic prohibition against nuclear weapons, and what I would consider the most important part of the JCPOA, which is the highly intrusive inspection and monitoring arrangement, that's permanent as well. But the main question that, of course, has to be asked in response to any of those criticisms is, what's the alternative? And the alternative was the situation we had before the agreement was negotiated, or actually while it was still under negotiation before it was signed. And that was a situation in which the Iranian nuclear program was expanding more and more. They had far more low-enriched uranium than they even do now, and had actually enriched up to the 20% level as well. And that's only a part of what they had to dismantle when the JCPOA came into effect. So we're getting a taste of what that alternative is over this last year or so, with the Iranians' incremental but reversible exceeding of the various limits.
Thank you. Given that that's where we are, and I think, Richard, you touched on this slightly a little earlier. We've seen the ramping up of sanctions on Iran recently, compounded one on top of the other, and then we've now seen a deal, or the suggestion of a deal, between China and Iran for $400 billion tech as well as military for subsidized oil over a 25-year period. How much do you think US policy towards Iran played in terms of pushing China and Iran together, this collaboration?
Well, I think that China and the US are in the midst of a huge battle for dominance, and a battle that over both trade issues and sort of geostrategic issues. China is on the upswing in terms of its own claims, territorial claims in the region, and its desire to exert influence internationally, but especially in its own region. And so I think that for China, this is a way to rub it in Trump's face, because Trump has been very hostile towards China, and all of his administration have as well. And you even have people like Steve Bannon saying that we should prepare for war with China. Not that I think that he has a huge impact on policy, but he is indicative of that sort of wing of the far right Trump administration and Republican Party. And so China is looking every way that it can to exert its influence and sort of tweak the US. And I think Iran is facing a situation where it's been placed in the corner by all of these maneuverings by the US, and also by sort of, I would guess you'd call it almost the abandonment by the Europeans, even though they're not characterizing it that way. So for the Iranians, it's really a way to come back onto the world stage and to take their place there and to be treated like a normal nation. And China sort of gives them I don't know, I forget, I'm losing track of what word I want to hear here, but to take its place as a lead, as a nation on the world stage.
I'm grateful. And Professor Mohammed, do you have some contribution there with respect to Iran's capacity, and maybe its newfound capacity with its newfound ties with China with respect to its nuclear program?
Well, let me just say that the opinion about the agreement with China within Iran is not uniform. the moderate and reformists have been grumbling about the agreement with China. They don't particularly want to be close only to China, but they advocate closer relationship with all countries of the world. And China has given an excuse to express that. At the same time, the hardliners support closer relationship with China simply because of what Richard said. Iran has been cornered. Iran has been put in a situation whereby the European countries that had promised Iran far more extended commercial relationship and support against the sanctions that the president has imposed on Iran didn't do anything. They talked about opening these channels whereby Iran could at least purchase humanitarian stuff that they need, such as, for example, medication and medical equipment and so on. But even that didn't materialize. They were talking about providing Iran with a $15 billion loan. That didn't materialize. Iran asked from International Monetary Fund for $5 billion. The European countries failed to support Iran to receive that loan. And in the midst of coronavirus, where Iran badly needed some very essential medication, the Europeans didn't really provide that. And the Trump administration that claimed that it has opened a channel in Switzerland through which Iran can buy its humanitarian needs turned out to be farce. The Swiss ambassador in Tehran said, unfortunately, there hasn't been a single transaction through that channel in Switzerland. Is not operating, it can't work. So under these conditions, of course, Iran has to turn elsewhere, not only to get itself out of the corner that the Trump administration has put it in, but also, as Richard said, make sort of a comeback to the international stage. Iran is a very important country. Iran is a country of 85 million highly educated people in one of the most strategic areas in the world with vast resources of energy and other things, and sitting on the occupying the entire northern shore of Persian Gulf and Sea of Oman. So obviously Iran cannot be isolated forever, and Iranians have to find a way to get themselves out of the situation that Trump has put them in. So it is in that context that Iran has reached some sort of agreement. But at the same time, I'm thinking that the fact that the foreign ministry, Iran's foreign ministry, actually went ahead and published the draft of the agreement a few weeks ago was not only to inform the public, but also to send a warning to the West, to the Trump administration, and to the European countries that, look, if you continue the destructive path that you have taken against Iran and continue that, then you are also going to move away from you and move towards China. And of course, given all the fierce competition that there is between the United States and China, and all these supposedly concerns that the Europeans have about China, a country like Iran with its strategic importance moving towards China is not good news for the European countries and the United States. And in fact, that provoked a lot of discussions and analysis here in the United States. A lot of people said that this agreement between Iran and China is one of the poisonous fruit of the policy of the Trump administration towards Iran, which is of course driven by not only President Trump's desire to destroy whatever achievement President Obama had, but also by lobbies of Saudi Arabia and Israel, and the important role that they play in setting this policy and putting pressure on Iran. Neither Saudi Arabia nor Israel want any close relationship between Iran and the United States. In fact, both Israel and Saudi Arabia have pushed the United States multiple times to attack Iran, if not all over the country, but at least Iran's nuclear facilities. The famous quote from King Abdullah that the United States should cut off the head of the snake, referring to Iran's nuclear facilities, is just one example of it. And of course, since Mohammed bin Salman took effective control of Saudi Arabia, he has pushed everything towards a confrontation with Iran. But that confrontation between Iran and Saudi Arabia cannot take place unless the United States is part of it. And therefore, they have been putting pressure on the Trump administration to attack Iran. So under these conditions, it's obvious that Iran would try to move away from the West and move towards Russia and China. So we have to see it in that context.
It is accepted that Iran is put under extreme economic pressure, and that any state that's under pressure is going to act within its limited capabilities to try and dissuade those who are putting that pressure on from applying it. But Iran has recently engaged in a number of activities that were seen as not really acceptable in terms of the rules of engagement for any state. For example, the taking of tankers that happened back in 2019, about a year ago, and then we have the Aramco attacks and what have you. Do you think that Iran behaving in that manner is going to be somewhat ameliorated by its linking it so strongly with China, who've demonstrated that they want to take a rules-based approach in an era when the US have stepped away from a rules-based approach and more of a deals-based approach? So do you think that the connection between China and Iran will now stabilize back to a rules-based approach diplomacy?
Can I just jump in here? Gareth is with us, but he does not have his camera on, and I don't believe he has his mic on. Said I tried to send a chat to him, but maybe he didn't see it. Is there a way we can get his attention?
I'll try. I see him, but yeah, I think we're having some issues with this really today.
He needs to like click on sharing the screen and.
Right. No, I think what he may need to do is to actually have his computer install the camera and the microphone.
Oh, so he doesn't have. He said he had Zoom installed, but I don't know.
He may want to try leaving the room and joining again, because as I try to unmute him, it simply doesn't have any effect. So I think he may want to try and come out of the room and back into the room.
Yeah, I sent him the link.
Hello? Hello?
We're hearing him.
You're hearing me? Yes, hello.
Now you just need to turn your camera on if you can.
I have everything that governs the sound and camera covered over by all of these icons, and I don't know how to.
Sure. Let's see if I can help.
Okay.
Well,
Zoom.
We can at least hear you if we can't see you. So.
Okay. I don't know how to do this. I don't see anything that tells me how to do this. Start my video. Okay, there we go. Start my video. Start my video. I clicked on it. Zoom wants to use your camera. Allow. Yeah. Okay. Zoom would like to access the camera. Allow. All right.
I see something's happening. Whoa, we got you.
Okay.
There's a light at the top of your screen. You might want to turn that off or move it.
Impression of a 1970s CIA interrogator.
All right. Turning this off. I don't know how to do that. Okay, that's gone. So I hope that works.
Yeah, you're with us.
Somehow. And tell me where we are in the discussion now.
Sure. The question was posed just now that Iran, since roughly June 2019, had been engaging in activities such as attacking sort of civilian ships, attacking the Aramco facility in Saudi Arabia. That were behaviors that aren't normally the repertoire of tools that a state uses. However, given that they have now moved into a position where they are doing a deal with China for $400 billion over a 25-year period, and given that China appears to be more interested in a rules-based system of international behavior rather than a deals-based system. Is it the opinion of the panel that the deal will cause Iran to move back into a more normal track in terms of diplomatic relations, rather than carrying on with slightly more exotic tools in its armory?
Well, I think I would depart from if there is a consensus, from this consensus that you've reflected, that the primary factor governing Iran's use of military force, or the use of military force by one of its allies over the past year or more, has been whether it had an alliance with China or not. I think the overwhelming factor in Iran's thinking has been the pressure from the United States on its economy by choking off its sales of oil to its regular customers around the world, and thus depriving it of most of its resources that it can use to maintain its economy, let alone develop. And in so doing, to respond to that, I think the Iranians felt that they had to put the United States on notice that if there were a conflict between the United States and Iran over this issue in the future, that the United States would have to pay a price. And that price would be that its bases and its forces stationed in the Middle East would be sitting ducks for Iranian missiles and their other means of hitting them. And they have succeeded in doing that. I believe that they did, in fact, accomplish that in 2019 by, first of all, shooting down the U.S. drone over the Strait of Hormuz, and then by attacking or having the Houthis attack the Abqaiq oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, which dramatically made the point for people in the United States who weren't aware of it that Iran was capable of reaching all U.S. bases and forces in the region, and that therefore it would not be a low-cost operation for the United States to engage in a military conflict with Iran. Now, this is not to say that I believe that the United States is interested in a military conflict. Indeed, I think that that the United States military and the Pentagon would very much like to avoid that. But from the Iranian point of view, I think that was, the feeling was that that was the minimum that they could do in order to position themselves better to deal with the United States, to have some leverage on the United States. And so I think that that was the fundamental notion behind the use of force in 2019. I think what's happened now in 2020, however, is...
We lost him.
Hello?
Have you lost me?
No, you're back.
I can hear you. There you go.
I think President Trump has now stumbled over COVID-19 very badly, and that his chances of winning are much slimmer than they were at the beginning of the year, and that Iran has adjusted its strategy to take that into account, with the thought in mind that a democratic administration, while it would be problematic in many ways, for sure, would be far more likely to agree to some kind of resumption of the JCPOA without demanding that Iran make totally unreasonable or irrational demands, that it would make such demands on Iran that it would be impossible. So I think that accounts for a rather sharp reversal in Iran's overall strategy over the past year, which now leaves it in a position where I think it's playing a waiting game until November 4th.
Yeah, I would agree with Gareth on both of his main points. Just to supplement what he said on a couple of things. One is, prior to the maximum pressure campaign instituted by the Trump administration, the Iranian leadership was acutely aware of all the hazards of going after someone else's oil industry, since they know it would mean obviously the prospect of reprisals against Iran's own oil industry. But once the Trump administration made it clear that its objective was to bring Iranian oil exports as close to zero as possible, they lost that reason for restraint. On the Chinese angle, just a couple of points about that. One, I don't think, whether the interlocutor to the Chinese follows a kind of rule-based order, as you put it in the initial question, affects Chinese policy very much. Their relationships are highly transactional, and just as they don't seem to care about observance of human rights, I don't think they care too much about observing rules of international conduct. The other point is that there's going to be a bit of a restraint in China's own incentives, in that Beijing still has equities and interests on the other side of the Gulf with the Gulf Arabs. So don't expect China to sort of throw in its lot entirely on the Iranian side with regard to the cross-Gulf rivalry.
Thank you for that. Coming back to that issue, if we have a Biden government in the US and we return to an Obama-like approach, how will this impact the relations between the anti-Iran alliances of Saudi Arabia, Israel, and their allies, given the new complex and the new dynamic in the region? Gareth?
Well, if I can start with that on that one, I think, in fact, that Israel at this moment, although it would like to see Trump stay in power, ideally, I think that would be its preference. It believes that they can certainly ally very effectively with the Biden administration in many ways, and carry out at least some of the pressure campaign that the Israelis have waged, although I think that there would be some limits placed on how far the Israelis could go beyond what certainly Mike Pompeo has been willing to allow. And the difference between what Mike Pompeo would allow and what Trump would allow we know that it exists, but it is hard to define precisely. And I think that's part of the problem that we face. So all I'm saying is that I don't think that the Israelis feel that a Biden administration would be unsupportive of its broad desire to put very strong pressure on Iran, but there still is going to be a fundamental conflict between a Biden administration, would be a conflict between Biden administration and Israel over the effort of the Israelis, or at least of Netanyahu, to essentially destroy the JCPOA, because there is still very strong belief on the part of the sort of centrist foreign policy, national security advisors of Biden, and Biden himself, for that matter, that the JCPOA is a valuable tool. And so I think that it still leaves a room for maneuver by the Israelis, if Biden is in power, to continue a pressure campaign, but it would be a little bit more muted than it has been.
I would like to add to what Gareth said, and that is, I believe, and many Iranians believe, that the long-term policy of the United States towards Iran has less to do with who the president is, rather than what the military, economic, security establishment of this country wants. The United States, over the past 50, 60 years, has never looked at Iran as, even during the regime of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the United States never looked at Iran as a partner or ally. Rather, it looked at Iran as a client state that should follow whatever the United States wanted and protect the United States' interests in the Persian Gulf, which is why President Nixon, for example, was willing to sell any arms to Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to do his dirty job in the Persian Gulf. So whether we have a Biden administration or a Trump administration, the long-term view and long-term policy towards Iran will not change fundamentally. Yes, the Biden administration may act more softly towards Iran, may open up some channels of communication, may lift some sanctions, but the fundamental view that Iran should be sort of a client state or a country that should follow U.S. policy and interests in the Middle East, or as Condoleezza Rice put it in 2006 when she was asked, why is it that you are so opposed to President Hugo Chavez? And she said, because Hugo Chavez doesn't have U.S. interests in his heart. So basically, they want Iranians to have U.S. interests in their heart and follow what the United States wants. And of course, a proud nation like Iran, with all its history and its strategic positions and so on, and given what the United States has done to Iran over the past many, many years, it has imposed economic sanctions on Iran for the past 40 years. One way or another, Iran has been under sanctions by the United States. And it was United States that overthrew Iran's democratically elected government of Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh. And that coup and the supporting the dictatorship of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi led to the Iranian Revolution, led to the Iran-Iraq war, during which the United States supported Iraq for 8 years, providing it with all sorts of support, whether it was logistic or intelligence, and the rest of the world, Britain, France, Germany, also armed Iraq to fight with Iran, and then imposed the harshest sanctions. Remember, it was President Obama, not President George W. Bush, that imposed the most crippling sanctions to date on Iran. It wasn't George W. Bush who did it. It was Obama who did it. It was Obama who cut off Iran from the SWIFT system that cut off Iran's relationship with all the banks and financial institutions around the world. It wasn't President George Bush who did it. And remember, President George Bush went along with the negotiations that the three European countries were carrying out with Mohammad Khatami during the administration of Mohammad Khatami. And remember, the administration of Mohammad Khatami was willing to put more restrictions than JCPOA eventually put on Iran. The administration of Mohammad Khatami was willing to limit Iran's enrichment program to only 3,000 centrifuges in return for guarantee that the United States will not attack Iran. And none of them eventually worked because the fundamental view is that Iran should follow whatever the interest of the United States is. So whether it's a Biden administration or a Trump administration, the pressure will continue. Maybe it will go up and down, maybe it will increase or decrease, but the fundamental view that Iran should follow this, and Iran should be just like Saudi Arabia or Egypt and so on, this view will continue. Many Iranians believe that, for example, if Hillary Clinton had been elected in 2016, the United States may have gone to war with Iran because Hillary Clinton had threatened Iran many, many times. Remember, it was Hillary Clinton who threatened to obliterate Iran. And it was only because Iran had said that if Israel attacks Iran, Iran will retaliate. And in response to that, Hillary Clinton said that we will obliterate Iran. Hillary Clinton also offered the same fate that she orchestrated for Libya to the Iranian opposition. She said that if they ask for us, we could help them the way we help the Libyan people. And we know what happened to Libya in 2011, and we know what is the fate of Libya at present. So we have to consider all of that. Of course, I would still like to see a Biden administration rather than a Trump administration. There's no question about it. But I don't believe that the fundamental view towards Iran will change. I think at some point, both the United States and the Islamic Republic of Iran have to realize that they have to reach some sort of accommodation. They have to reach some sort of understanding. But if they don't, then we will see the same type of thing, maybe with a less intensity, but the same type of policy towards Iran will continue.
Well, great. Professor, I'll remind you, though, that the charm of Hillary Clinton is what delivered us a Trump administration in the first place.
If I could just add further, to what Mohammed just said. it's not only the case that that it was the Obama administration that had the most severe, until Trump, of course, the most severe sanctions economically against Iran. But it's also the case that it really was not so much the presidential decision that was involved in this variation in terms of how much and how severe the economic sanctions against Iran were, but rather whether the Treasury Department of the United States had come up with the appropriate or the toughest conception of a sanctions program. And we know from the testimony of the Treasury Department's high-ranking officials themselves that it wasn't until the Obama administration they came up with this magic formula of being able to attach some language to a UN Security Council resolution that would essentially penalize or criminalize the Iranian economy by making the case, completely fabricated case, that it was already controlled by the IRGC and therefore was an economy that was inherently going to support terrorism, and that therefore anybody else in the world should not have any economic relations with Iran in any way, shape, or form, because they would be in danger of being considered to support terrorism. So why did this particular idea arise at that moment? Because that was the FDD, the Friends, the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy, were helping them come up with this idea. And the wedding between pro-Israeli lobby and the Treasury Department is extremely close, extremely tight, and has been ever since the beginning of the Bush administration. So again, we come back to the role of Israel here as really a very vital element in the policy of the United States toward Iran, ever since really the Bill Clinton administration, but particularly starting with Bush.
Can I just add something here? I would like to, at some point in the conversation, talk about what we would like to see in the long term happen. I think most of us want to see a normalized relationship between the West and Iran. And I know that we're all very downbeat about the possibility of that happening, given what we've been talking about. But if we were to envision that, what would need to happen on both sides? And will it take generations for this to happen? Or how do we get there, basically, if we ever get there?
Well, if I can respond to that, but begin with a prelude that's partly a response to the comments over the last couple of minutes. Of course, there's this whole history that has affected nationwide attitudes and perceptions, both on the Iranian side and the American side. And Professor Sahimi, rehearsed part of that history. But I think it's a mistake to understate the really fundamental difference between the schools of thought represented by the last two U.S. administrations. You can talk about the sanctions that Obama applied. They were applied for the purpose of reaching something like the JCPOA, after which they were relieved. That was an approach based on diplomacy and trying to find common ground. That is fundamentally different in a major, major way from what we're seeing right now under the Trump administration, where there is no such goal. The goal, I think, in the hearts of most people like Pompeo is regime change. But if it's not that, let's just cripple the current regime, and as Jerry Rubin used to say, we'll groove on the rubble, with no real plan for what comes after that. So Richard, in response to your question, I think step one, if we did have a Biden administration, is restoring compliance with the JCPOA. And you can say all you want about, well, we're closer to the sunset clause provisions and so on and so forth. And, there are things that, could have been done better. But step one, just to get to the point where we can consider what the longer range trajectory ought to be, is to return to compliance with that. Now, there'd have to be a little sort of tactical arrangement as to how you'd handle that timing wise. I think what my advice to a President Biden would be, you announce early on, yes, we are returning to compliance with the JCPOA, under the expectation, as the Iranian regime has led us to believe, that they would quickly return to compliance as well, and set some time limit on it, say, 2 or 3 months. And if the Iranians aren't back in full compliance with the nuclear limits, then we slap some sanctions back on. That could be a very clear understanding. Then you've got the basis for further rounds of negotiation on not only nuclear matters, but all the other issues that divide us. And I think if we're talking about overcoming some of the problems that people perceive with the sunset clauses, you say, okay, maybe step 2 is a more for more agreement on the nuclear side, that some of the limitations are extended, but in return for that, the U.S. is going to have to offer up something. And I think the something in this case would be a more assured way of Iran getting the benefit of normal commerce. I mean, even under the Obama administration, there was a lot of disappointment in Iran about how normal commerce did not come to life. And the Obama administration made a good faith effort to try to reassure the private sector, yeah, you can do this now and you can do that. But a lot of it just didn't work very well, because there was still this hesitation to make deals with the Iranians that might inadvertently, get a business or a bank in some sort of trouble. So that's the sort of trajectory I see. Restore compliance with the existing agreement, and then that's a basis for negotiating more for more, not just in the nuclear area, but on other issues that divide us.
Well, I mean,
let me also point out that Iran's presidential election is next year in May of 2021. If President Biden announces right after his administration starts that the United States will return to JCPOA and it will deliver on its obligation, provided that Iran also takes steps backward towards full compliance with JCPOA, that will affect Iranian presidential election, and that would help Iranian moderates and reformists within Iran. Iranian moderates and reformists in Iran are under tremendous pressure. Hardliners have been telling them, we told you so. The United States cannot be trusted. You trusted the United States and see what happened. And they have been talking about, having a revolutionary young president next year that would carry on with the ideals of the Iranian revolution. And of course, what the hardliners mean by that means a hardline policy towards the United States. But experience has shown that whenever the West, and in particular the United States, has allowed some sort of opening towards Iran, that has helped moderates and reformists to at least take the presidency. And if a Biden administration does that, let's say in January, after it takes over, that we are going to return to JCPOA, and just as Dr. Pilar said, we give Iran 2 months or 1 month or 3 months to also deliver on its obligation, then that will help the cause of Iranian moderate forces. And in the long run, that is in the interest of everybody. In the long run, those forces that want have good relationship between Iran and the rest of the world, rather than just between Iran and, let's say, the East, as they call it in Iran, is better suited for Iran rather than a one-sided relation. If Iran is in a corner and tries to make deals with China, it may also have to give up major concessions to China in order to satisfy the Chinese. But if Iran can play a good relationship with European Union, and at least a relation with the United States with less tension, then that would also help the Iranian people and the Iranian state to better play its card with China. So I just hope that a Biden administration will announce very early on that it will go back to JCPOA, because that would help the cause of the forces within Iran that want a more moderate and more realistic approach to foreign policy.
No, I'm grateful for that. And just going back to Richard's point, how do we look at a way forward for Iran to normalize relations with the West. But in terms of Iran's neighbors, they haven't stayed still either. You know, we have now Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, whose idea about what's acceptable behavior is somewhat medieval a little bit, basically. If you ask some of his own family members and their bank account managers these days, then they'll you know, it doesn't inspire confidence domestically. We also have the UAE, who now has a nuclear facility in the region. So how does that impact the argument against Iran having nuclear weapons when one of its own neighbors, and you know, hostile neighbors, has now got nuclear capability, as well as having a series of Sunni neighbors who have very much thawed towards Israeli relations and effectively now present something of a block against them, which perhaps didn't exist in the past.
If I could take that one on, to begin with, I would put the emphasis not so much on the idea on whether Iran was going to get nuclear weapons, but rather whether Iran has the right to even defend itself with conventional weapons. Are you still getting my picture?
Yeah.
Okay. Because it disappeared in front of me. The problem here is that, of course, for decades now, we've had this narrative about Iran coveting nuclear weapons, which I've written about very extensively, and it's covered in full in my book, Manufactured Crisis, that is simply based on a lot of fiction and hardly any truth whatsoever. And I don't want to get into that subject, but I just want to flag that as a fundamental issue that still is very troubling in terms of trying to reach a rational point of departure in American policy toward Iran. But beyond that, and I think even more problematic, is this whole idea that animates US policy, and its allies have joined in as usual, that says that Iran must not have missiles that are capable of reaching any place else outside their country, and without giving any particular reason except, well, they want nuclear weapons. But basically, Iran, as under present circumstances, is being treated as not having the normal attributes of a sovereign state, the ability to deter countries that have threatened to attack it, including the United States and Israel in particular, going back all the way in Israel's case to the mid-1990s. And so I think we really have to deal substantively with that problem up front, and really make it clear to policymakers, both in the United States and in Europe, that this is simply not in line with reality, and indeed it's an attribute of a policy of hegemony and empire rather than of a normal state in the case of the United States. So that would be a point of departure that I would flag as extremely important to begin with. And I would just point out that the United States has its own socio-political crisis, which is building rapidly, and nobody knows how that's going to turn out. And so the problem of coming up with a rational policy toward Iran may well be at stake in what happens, what comes out of this. I imagine it's going to be a rather long-running crisis in the United States, which is going to affect the ability and the will of the United States to continue to play the kind of hegemonic role that it has played now for many decades. So I just want to make that part of the consideration of the problem as well.
The issue that Gareth raises of Iran's ability to defend itself conventionally or to deter threats to it is not only quite pertinent and has been for some time, but is quite timely, given how the Trump administration right now is trying to make an issue out of the conventional arms embargo, which it wants to extend. And what is often forgotten is that that particular provision of the JCPOA and the associated UN Security Council resolution, even though it has to do with conventional arms, it really was just one more sanction against Iran to try to induce them to negotiate on the nuclear deal. So, by rights, that embargo should have come off when the JCPOA was initially signed. The Obama administration argued to keep it in place for 5 years, and hence we have this date coming up in October. So we'll hear a lot more about that over the next couple of months. But Gareth's quite right that there's been this reluctance to recognize that Iran has very legitimate deterrence and defense needs when it's facing threats in its own region from those who not only have missiles, which it doesn't have beyond a certain range, but also air forces far superior to its own. I mean, just the UAE Air Force alone would overmatch whatever the Iranians have with their outdated equipment. And that's something people often forget.
If I can just jump in. Oh, sorry, Mohammed, go ahead.
In fact, Iran's Air Force belongs to a museum rather than...
Yeah, basically, yes.
Rather than a credible deterrent force.
Yeah, in fact, I think we all know that Iran is actually dependent primarily on Hezbollah to deter Israel. I mean, without Hezbollah's 130,000 missiles and rockets, they would not have a deterrent. They've admitted it even formally, not formally, but informally.
That's true.
But having looked at the Trump administration when it was coming in, just before it was coming into power, and its orientation towards international affairs, NATO generally, also Afghanistan, its position towards Iran stands somewhat in contrast with the rest of its purported view of stepping away as the world's policeman. Can you account for that in any way other than it being linked directly to Israeli interests?
Well, I think Professor Sahimi was quite correct in speaking of Israeli as well as Saudi interest and pressure. Yes, the fact of political life in the United States makes the Israeli side in particular an extremely important determinant in all of this, and it's affected a lot of other things besides policy toward Iran. Obviously, things with regard to the Palestinian conflict with Israel. So, yes, that is probably the single biggest factor.
If I can just talk about the issue of proliferation, which we alluded to earlier about the UAE nuclear plant that they just brought online. There's been also, I believe, the Trump administration has agreed to some sort of a deal with Saudi Arabia to, I don't know if they're going to provide an entire nuclear facility or not, but I think we have to also emphasize the fact that, Israel has, by any different measure, like from 200 to 400 nuclear weapons and the most advanced military in the region. And we've got the possibility, Saudi Arabia has threatened to become a nuclear state as well. And so it just becomes a very dangerous game when the U.S. really is promoting proliferation really in the region, when we're also supposedly trying to, prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons in Iran. And I don't know where this game ends. It's just incredibly dangerous, and we're sort of playing with fire, I would say.
Well, there is that, but in terms of with Iran and the missile attack on the Aramco facility, and the lack of direct response to that, would you say then that despite America pushing for proliferation of weapons in the region, Yemen, what have you, but would that suggest that the Carter Doctrine is now dead?
Well, the attack on the Saudi oil facilities last fall, besides being, as Gareth spoke to it earlier, a message to the United States, it was also intended as a message to the Saudis.
Yeah.
That if infrastructure that's extremely important to you would be immediately vulnerable if anybody, whether it's the United States or Israel, attacks us. And I think that was a wake-up call to Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi leadership, especially given the precision with which that attack evidently was carried out. And if you recall some of the pictures of these, extremely well-placed munitions in the storage tanks, it was quite impressive.
Well, the precision was economic as well, not just military, in that the Aramco flotation was massively affected by that, the timing of that as well.
That's right.
And I
Something
think
very important to MBS.
And let me add this.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead.
Richard, go ahead. Yeah, Gareth, go ahead.
So
Yeah, I was going to say that invoking the Carter Doctrine seems pretty archaic at this point because of massive changes that have occurred in the politics of the region since the 1979, 1980. And of course, the first thing is that it was directed against the Soviet Union, and the notion that the Soviets were somehow going to disrupt the flow of oil or threaten the flow of oil in the Middle East, which no one in the administration, even in the Carter administration, really believed sincerely. That was a complete fabrication or fiction. And then you have, of course, the disappearance of the Soviet Union. And, it's really never been the case that anybody has had in mind any threat to the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz until the United States threatened, or not only threatened, but actually deprived Iran of, again, its oil trade with the rest of the world, in which case the Iranians turned around and said, well, if you're going to say that, then we're no longer going to guarantee that we wouldn't disrupt the flow of oil if we weren't allowed to sell our oil. But that's the only threat that has ever come about, a potential threat that has ever been conceived since the Carter Doctrine was invented.
Sure. I think in terms of the flow of oil, the US were happy to watch Syria and in fact ISIS allow the flow of oil from occupied Syria to Turkey. It was bizarrely more the Russians that tried to put a stop to that flow rather than anyone else. But it does show the granular dynamics of the situation. Okay, I think we've come up to an hour. So, and I'm very grateful for all the speakers to have carried on so far. If I could open up to the floor for anyone who wants to pose a question, I'd be grateful if anyone has any questions to address the floor with that. So you're all capable of unmuting yourselves should you wish to speak. It'd be helpful if you put your hand up. Yes, Boji, would you like to go ahead?
Yes, first of all, thank you very much for this very informative discussion. And I've been an activist and peace activist for decades, and focused on Iran. And inside Iran, there is a struggle for democracy on the one hand, but external colonialism has constantly had crushed Iran's democracy. Dr. Sahimi referred to 1953 coup. And the policy of the US after the rise of the neocons, the policy of the US toward Iran has been kind of a mixture of desire for regime change and reduced to dual containment, especially under Clinton's. And then Obama changed that to critical engagement, which even that critical engagement, as critical as it was, eventually it produced the JCPOA. And of course, Trump and Israel and Saudi Arabia destroyed it in collaboration with the extremists inside Iran, because both sides need each other as enemy. And I believe under Biden administration, that fundamental tenet of the US imperial policy toward Iran and other countries needs to change. And we need to have what I call just engagement. And I just finished by saying that I heard Dr. Pilar talking about after Biden goes back to the JCPOA, I hope, and immediately lifts all the sanctions that are possible to go for more. See, this more for more, if I may respectfully submit to Dr. Pillar, is exactly what hardliners in Iran who don't want normalization of relations with the world, and they are pushing for Iran, making Iran become dependent on China and Russia, they constantly say, and Ayatollah Khamenei has said, if we accede to JCPOA, then they want more. So this more for more, to me, is something that is similar to the Obama administration's critical engagement versus what we need is just engagement. Just engagement with emphasis on just, which I'm not sure whether the US foreign policy is capable of justice. And so I would appreciate if people would comment. Thank you. Sorry if I went too long.
Who would you like that question to be addressed to in particular, or is it open for the panel?
Well, I'll respond. You know, more for more, what that contrasts with is, you know, more for nothing, which is what the current U.S. administration's policy is, or on the surface it is, if it isn't just a cover for regime change. So I think, you know, what was your term, sort of just engagement, or?
Just engagement with emphasis on just, but
yes.
also just engagement.
Yes, well, I think
don't bring in anything else.
Well, I think just implies that there has to be some mutual advantage here if it's politically feasible at all. I mean, it would not be realistic for any, whether it's Joe Biden or any U.S. leader, to say, okay, the U.S. has been the evil party here, and we're going to make all kinds of new concessions, and we don't expect anything in return. You know, nothing like that is going to happen. I do think that there is some realistic bargaining space here, in that, you know, there are concerns on the one side about continued Iranian nuclear activity after certain limits are lifted, but there's the major concern on the Iranian side to get real economic benefit, not just something on paper, but real benefit, and not just humanitarian goods, although that's important as well, but to make the kind of benefit that's going to make a major difference to the ordinary Iranian's life.
Well, what if changing the U.S. basic imperialist tenet of its foreign policy? That needs to change for the sake of Israel long-term, you know, existence, as well as U.S. to have a foreign policy that is worthy of a civilized nation, as opposed to an imperialist, hegemonic power that constantly creates conditions where people in other countries, especially in Iran, who don't trust. There is 150 years of history of the imperial and colonial powers constantly, you know, abusing people of color. This is all the way go back to the doctrine of discovery and the genocide of the Native Americans. So that the U.S. needs to become civilized, if I may say, politely.
Unfortunately, the questioner is absolutely right, and the United States must pass through some sort of revolution in values in order to have a decent foreign policy. I'm sorry to say, but it's absolutely true. No question about it in my mind. It's not going to happen through change of administrations. It's not going to happen from, you know, by one set of national security elites replacing another one. That's clear. It's got to be much more fundamental. And I don't know how we do it, if we can do it, but it has to happen.
I think you did premise that though, Moji, with Iran is currently engaged in a struggle internally for democracy versus autocracy. But I think it's fair to say that the US is also engaged in exactly that struggle, albeit from a slightly different starting point. So you know, given that the two things are in flux, that's what makes it a little bit harder for anyone to cast the runes and see what may be coming out of that in the future. But stupidity seems to be the thing that reigns supreme at the moment with respect to chaos.
If I could,
sure.
If I could just jump in, I think we also have to look at a sort of ongoing evolution in American politics. We have the rise of a progressive wing in the Democratic Party, although it's not perfect in terms of its own foreign policy approach. If we talk about Bernie Sanders and his views of the region and of Israel, but we're moving in a very interesting direction. I think it's going to be a very slow and incremental process because we have, we have 4 members of the squad who have been elected. We have new members now elected to Congress, and it looks like we're going to have even more progressives in Congress that are going to really spur change. And I think they're willing to an extent to take on the Israel lobby and to and question the shibboleths that have undergirded U.S. foreign policy towards Israel and towards the Middle East. Unfortunately, this is going to require patience, and it's not going to happen overnight. But having a candidate like Bernie Sanders who's willing to raise questions and for example, say that we need to condition U.S. Military aid to Israel on its following international law and issues like the settlements is really an astonishing change from even a couple of years ago. So unfortunately, this is not going to happen overnight. Like Gareth was talking about a revolution, which I think all of us would like to see sooner rather than later. But things don't move as fast as we would like. But I'm hopeful in that sense that that some of these candidates can jump up from Congress, get elected to the Senate, maybe take on a presidential campaign, because I don't see Bernie doing another one of those. But someone I would hope and expect is going to take on that mantle in, if Biden is elected in 4 or 8 years after that. So hopeful, I would say.
One needs to be realistic. If we have a President Biden come next January, even if Joe Biden's heart is entirely in the right place on all these issues we've talked about, and even if the indications of his discussions he's had with Bernie Sanders have moved him in this direction or that direction, a President Biden will be facing an enormous task after enormous damage of the previous 4 years on a whole host of fronts, both foreign and domestic. He will have one of the most difficult, challenging situations that any U.S. president has faced, short of something like Lincoln and the Civil War. So I just would like to temper the expectations, whether our particular interest is the Israeli-Palestinian problem or Iranian issues. This poor man, even if he retains all his energies as in his late 70s, is going to have so much to deal with. It's so difficult. Let's keep our expectations reasonable.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, yes.
To Mr. Pillar, how are you doing, sir? You mentioned about the JCPOA and getting back onto JCPOA. I think if you look at the details, it's very, very complicated because Iran has made progress in advanced centrifuges, and the promise of those commercial planes have not materialized. I don't think it's something that Mr. Sullivan, if Mr. Biden wins, would be able to manage in 2 to 3 months. There's a lot of discomfort with re-engaging with the American administration, and the commercial planes was one item. If you look at the IAEA report, they have made tremendous progress in R&D efforts that were planned to be done 2 to 3 years from now. Walking back down that effort would be a tremendous effort. I just wanted to know if you have looked at the details. I understand what you were saying. Thank you.
Well, what you mentioned, it needs to be background to follow on negotiations for any future agreements. I don't think that obviates what I said about getting back in compliance with the existing agreement that's already on the books and that the current U.S. administration abandoned. That's what we were talking about in the 2 to 3 month time frame. I think U.S. negotiators are going to be smart enough to realize that things like knowledge of how advanced centrifuges operate is not something that can be negotiated away. Instead, you have to come up with arrangements that involve limits to stockpiles, that certainly involve the inspections, in a way that assures everyone that there isn't some dash being taken toward a nuclear weapon. So yeah, those, of course, it's a complicated topic. The JCPOA itself was something like 140 pages. I don't want to minimize the task, but I don't think that's any reason to shy away from at least coming back into compliance with the agreement we've got.
And in addition, if Iran has made great progress regarding advanced centrifuges, once you make the progress, you cannot just forget the
right.
science that has been developed, and you cannot just say, well, we learn how to do it, but from now on, we are going to forget about it. No.
and that's true, by the way, even on weapons-related work. And we do know there was such work being done earlier on. I'm going a couple of decades back.
Yeah.
And that's knowledge that's not forgotten. But that's why you have the intrusive inspection arrangements.
Exactly. That was exactly my point, because they wanted to elongate the sunset clause, but now all of a sudden we're entering the timeline in the 2 years ahead. That was exactly what my point was. And you understand the Israelis' main issue, as I think you mentioned, or Dr. Sahimi mentioned, was the sunset clause. This is shortened. So that's the complication I was trying to bring up. And also the billions of dollars Iran has lost in the past 2 years because of these sanctions. How are you going to justify that to their people and so on? That was my point. Thank you.
Sure. Yes, these are both ways in which we'll have 4 wasted years that will make the future negotiations all the more difficult. You're quite right about that.
In fact, I would like to pose a question to Dr. Pilar and Dr. Porter. Iran has lost tremendously economically because of the Trump exiting from JCPOA. Their oil export has reduced to, they say, about 100,000 barrels per day. The petrochemical exports have completely stopped. The metal exports have stopped, and so on and so forth. So Iran has had tens of billions of dollars in loss. So can Iran legitimately say and ask a Biden administration that, yes, we will go back to our obligation, but you also need to compensate, at least to some level, for the losses that we had as a result of your own country breaking its promises and exiting illegally from JCPOA? I say illegally because the JCPOA was endorsed by Security Council 2231 and filed under Chapter 7 of United Nations Charter, which means that its provisions is obligatory for every member state. So if you break and violate a resolution filed under Chapter 7, you're doing something illegal. So can Iran make a demand like that?
Of course they can make a demand like that.
No.
I don't think it's not politically realistic to expect even a Biden administration to come up with what would be sort of reparations for past U.S. violations. I think it is realistic to, in the course of future negotiations, find better ways for the free exercise of the private sector to bring the economic benefits to Iran that they've been deprived of.
I would say it's not only a reasonable thing to ask, even though they may not be able to get it, but I doubt that any Iranian government could go back to the negotiating table with the United States without making some kind of demand such as that. I mean, it's been pointed out that the government is under terrific political pressure from the more fundamentalist nationalist right, if you will, which is clearly true. And it has been that it's been true for many years now, and it's gotten much more severe in the last few years, the last couple of years. So I think that it's very likely that, assuming the scenario that we're discussing here, that they will in fact be raising that as part of their negotiating position, despite the fact that they probably know it's not going to be possible. In some degree, at least, because the United States is flat on its back economically as well. And it's less realistic now than it was 5 years ago. So, but the politics on both sides are very difficult at this point, and that needs to be understood as a starting point.
I think that question and that answer series allows for now, was it Mazdak to bring up a good question he put in.
Yes, hello. I already wrote my question. Thank you everybody for this wonderful discussion. I hope it can be repeated many times in the future too. So my question is that don't you think that the presence of China and Russia through an empowered Iran will bring some balance into the region, which was dominated in the last decades very poorly, I would say, and managed very poorly by the Western powers and their client states?
Well, I think it's very, very clear that the Trump administration has basically destroyed our leverage in the Middle East and elsewhere. And it's only natural, I think, that vacuum would have been filled by other powers like those two countries you mentioned. And I do think that competition in that sense is going to be constructive and helpful. And it will also present challenges for Biden when he takes over, because he's going to try to resume, take over where Obama left off. But you have this 4 years of devastation that Trump has wreaked. So it's going to be an even more complicated situation in terms of geopolitics in the region when you have China playing a role that it never exercised. But at least it will be competition that will be based on commercial interests and not hopefully on military confrontation, which is what Trump and Israel and Saudi Arabia have been following so far.
And on that point, it's interesting to look at the whole nature of oil, really, and its waning import on the world stage. By the time Iran comes in from the cold, will oil even factor as much as maybe perhaps lithium will in the future?
Well, I think that what's interesting about Iran compared to other states in the region is that even though oil is a very critical factor, maybe I guess it's most important export, but it has such a diverse population and a diverse economy when the economy is functioning, and such a large diversity of skill sets of people that I think if things could be more normalized, I think that Iran has a great potential commercially and technologically. And I think that's, if we're going to look at positive, constructive things in the future, I think that could be brought to bear if we can normalize this situation more.
And could I just go back to the original question for a moment, just very quickly? I'll just have a 1 minute intervention here. This is about the whole question of balance of power or power balancing, and whether we now are going to see a new power balance because of China and Russia. I think that the United States has really not had meaningful power in the Middle East from the beginning of this whole, crisis period of 2000, 2003, let's say, just for the sake of argument, because it used military force in ways that was unwise and unsuccessful, and proved that it could not be an effective way of using power in the Middle East. And so it really discredited that whole way of acting. And so if there is such a thing as power balancing, which I'll accept that the concept—
Of course you're all fucking Jews.
Yeah, shut the fuck up, dumb bitch ass motherfucker, you nigger. Shut the fuck. Yeah, imagine muting me.
Iran is
Imagine
pointless. I'm
muting
going to
someone.
nuke Iran.
You're so dumb. You guys are
3
Jews.
minutes.
You fucking dumbasses,
Fuck
motherfucker.
Iran,
Fuck
fuck
you.
Iran, fuck
Fuck
Iran, fuck
Aaron.
Iran, fuck Iran.
Fuck-
Sorry about that. Sometimes this happens. Let me just do a little bit of weeding, and we'll resume. Remove. What was this? There we go. Sorry, I saw a bunch of people come in, and I thought this would happen. Where were we? My apologies. I will unmute Paul, if I may, and if you could resume before the hiatus.
Okay, I just want to put in a plug for a new policy paper on the Middle East that the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft just published last month. I'm a co-author of it. And it really reflects some of the themes that have just been mentioned over the last couple of minutes. Balance of power as opposed to a striving for hegemony. And it also addresses the oil issue and how the changed role of oil in Western economies has figured into this. But it's basically pro-balance of power in very much the spirit of some of the comments we've just heard.
Is that going to be available on the website?
It is. Look up Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. It was released just last month, about 3 weeks ago.
Okay. We can put up a link on the WhatsApp group, I think, Tasnime.
Yeah, sure. It was rather amusing to see that a discussion of balance of power. A bunch of Nazis rather didn't want to hear that.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'll revert back to anyone in the. If we could have the questions typed, I think, in the chat, that will, and then we'll have them read out with people who are trusted to speak. That would be better, I think, at the moment. So if anyone wants to put a question in chat. Or Paul, if you'd rather go into a little bit more on the Quincy Institute paper, that would be helpful.
Well, no, I was just struck by how much what we have to say in that paper reflects the themes that were mentioned by a couple of my co-panelists and some of the other participants. Richard, I'll try to remember as soon as we're off to send you the link to it. And,
Great, thanks.
And the Quincy is a relatively new institute, just got underway in the last few months, and this was, I think, the second full-scale policy paper that the institute's put out.
So, is it going to try to play a role in a Democratic administration, like some of the progressive think tanks try to do?
That's the idea, and it's sort of the more realist or progressive realist answer to things like FDD.
Mm-hmm. Amen to that.
Excuse me, if I may ask another question.
Of course.
Nowadays, everybody is speaking about the deal between Iran and China. Many in Iran would like to present it as a threat to Iran and its sovereignty. But I would like to ask the panel, what do you think the threats of such a deal can be for Iran, for the region, and the world?
Well, I suppose there's the issue that's often brought up when we talk about China's Belt and Road Initiative. Now, this goes beyond the Belt and Road Initiative. The questions of debt traps and how some of these agreements have been cleverly designed by the Chinese to increase kind of an economic stranglehold on the other party. I have no idea whether that will arise in connection with any agreements with Iran, or the Iranians will be big enough and smart enough to avoid the sorts of traps that, say, Burkina Faso might fall into. But it is the sort of issue that always comes up when we talk about deals with China.
We have Moji, if you would like to type your question. Where are you? Moji Aga. I'll unmute you.
Thank you. I typed in what I'm fearful of, especially when I hear the word realist. It scares me because it goes back to a notion that goes back to the Cold War, whereby the US and previous to that British hegemony, and of course Israeli included in the middle of it, is addicted to a Cold War environment whereby you have a balance of terror. And this balance of terror, which the realists, which are not as bad as neoconservatives, of course, thank God for that, but these realists are constantly harken back to that we need to have a world, we need to conceive of a world in which it's a jungle. Therefore, it's realistic to want to have a balance of terror. And what I'm fearful of is if Iran is pushed, or the regime is pushed toward China and Russia without a balance in terms of the US and Israel trying to civilize their foreign policy, then it becomes a balance of terror anew, except in this case, the Soviet Union has gone and has been replaced with China. And that to me is the most important thing that calls for, in terms of a US foreign policy toward Iran, is just engagement. Without any other more for more, or other things that constantly give the hardliners in the theocrats inside Iran the ammunition they need to suppress democracy. So
I would just advise you not to get hung up on the historical baggage associated with certain grand strategic terms.
Well, but the historical baggage, this is a region of the world with 8,000 years of history. Now the US is, of course, is a baby power with lots of muscle, but the historical thing that you're saying don't get hung up on, people are hung up on.
Yeah, well, you were talking about the Cold War and going well beyond the region. The sorts of issues we've been discussing this afternoon, the opposite of a realist approach is being unrealistic, and I think it's unrealistic. Say some of the assumptions that seem to underlie current U.S. policy under the Trump administration, that we can make a list of 12 or 13, extreme demands of Iran. If we just put enough pressure on them, the regime will collapse, and we're going to have some alternative that'll be to our liking, that'll accept all those demands. That's unrealistic. I think a realist approach recognizes some of the things that this discussion has covered about Iran having legitimate defense and deterrence needs, about Iran having legitimate complaints economically about some of what's taking place. Recognizing those things is realist, and it's realistic. That's the context in which I'm using the term.
From my point of view, we have a delusional foreign policy right now, and realism is a breath of fresh air compared to what we've got. And I don't think, realism in terms of what the questioner was talking about, it doesn't need to end there in terms of our policy. We can work towards our policy being more just, sure, and more progressive and constructive as time goes on. But we have to transition from insanity to some level of pragmatism, and realism, it's okay with me right now.
I would like to add, am I on?
Yes.
Okay, I would like to add to this by saying that some of the delusional policy of Trump administration towards Iran is the result of the so-called advice they have been receiving from Iranian opposition in the United States. In FDD, for example, we have several Iranians that have advocated even war with Iran. They have told Pompeo and people like him that if you just put enough pressure, people will go out on the street and demonstrate and topple the government. That's not going to happen. And not because Iranian people are happy with what they have, but rather because the middle class in Iran, which is actually fully integrated with the rest of the world, is very well informed, is very well connected, recognizes the danger that Iran would become another Syria or another Iraq. So for now, they are not going to go out on the street the way we saw it in 2009 during the Green Movement. Rather, they want, first and foremost, for Iran's national security to be preserved. At the same time, the tremendous pressure that economic sanctions has imposed on Iran has basically pushed the middle class just to think about its economic survival rather than anything else. At this point, they want just to survive with the hope that things will get better. And that's part of the delusion that Pompeo and people like him have. He and people like him think that if we rob Iran from any sources that it has, a revolution will come and people will topple the regime, or will create a situation such that we can say we need a humanitarian intervention the way they did it in Libya. But that's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. And in fact, if anything, this helps the hardliner because as long as there is threat to Iran's national security, the hardliner can justifiably use it to even increase the repression because they say there is a foreign threat against Iran's national security. And this is the type of delusion that they have. But of course, when we have a Secretary of State like Pompeo that talks about how the Bible has influenced his thinking and has said, and has said that we decided that the Golan Heights belongs to Israel, the way he speaks, and it seems like his whole mission is destroy Iran for the sake of Israel. Then what do you expect? I mean, this is the type of policy that you would expect from an administration like this. It's totally delusional.
If I could, excuse me, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question regarding the whole foreign policy of the United States in future. As you know, there are two issues which is really just very important right now, which is going on. One of them is Corona. The other one is all the demonstration which is happening based on the racism, but we know underneath of that was economic situation. United States they are talking about the 1930s crisis, which happened. This is going to be worse than that, as far as I am concerned, because at that time, United States had a couple of things which has helped them. One is the World War II. The other one was the United States was the industrial country. Industry was very strong there. It's not the industrialized which is happening right now. The question is that, what do you think? And we know China is coming up. I just want to know, as an expert that you guys are following the whole things, what do you think as far as these two effects, which is happening right now in the middle of the United States, is going to have in the future, which it's not going to be that much far away. This is going to be probably, this situation is going to affect immediately because of the economic problem that we are facing in the United States. We are talking about the 40% of the people are out of job and all these things. So I'm sure it's going to have effect in all not only Middle East, it's going to have in the Venezuela and other countries. So I just would like to know, since one of the issues here is talking about the United States, I would like you guys explain exactly what is going to happen.
One point that I would make about that question is that the United States economy is in a totally different situation from what it was, as you suggested in your question, in the 1930s and early 1940s. That is to say, it was in a position where starting to gear up for a war would obviously generate a huge number of new jobs, whereas now the military budget is a dead weight on the ability of the United States to take care of other needs. And that's because of the nature of the military budget. It's no longer a matter of simply ginning up conventional jobs to make airplanes and tanks and so forth. It's high-tech weaponry as well as many other things. The point is that, that this military budget is a dead weight on the American people and their ability to do many things. And it imposes choices on the United States as a nation in terms of what it really wants to do, what it wants to be. If it wants to play a role of leadership in the world, and in this case in the Middle East, by using its diplomacy, it's going to have to reduce the power and the budgetary resources that go to the military-industrial complex. I think that's quite clear at this point. There's going to be much more political pressure on the military budget from now on. How fast and how far that plays out is difficult to say, but that's one prediction that I would feel confident in making.
I think it depends on what time frame we're talking about in order to answer the question. In the immediate future, the next 3 months, I worry about how these factors that you mentioned, the COVID-19 pandemic, the economic problems, are weighing down on Trump's reelection chances, that might motivate him all the more to pull something that would be an October surprise that might involve nasty events in the region that we're talking about. After January, if we do have a President Biden, then the first few months get into my earlier comment about don't expect too much from him because he's just going to be so weighed down in particular by the pandemic and the recession. And then over the longer term, I would agree with Gareth that, and this would be true if you have a more Democratic rather than a Republican administration and congressional majorities, that we would get more away from the military spending that, as he correctly says, has weighed down on the economy. And I think that would have some follow-on effects in terms of a lesser likelihood of the sort of military expeditions overseas, including in the Middle East, that have come all too easily in the past.
I have a question. What is going to be the alternative as far as the progressive people who we are saying they are mobilizing sort of, as far as this, whatever is happening. I mean, the question is that what is happening in that regard? Because, do we see any alternative here except Democratic Party or a Republican Party?
The way the U.S. electoral and political system works, we're kind of locked into a two-party system. I personally would love to see ranked choice voting, which would give more of an opportunity to other political movements and parties without people being afraid of having wasted their vote. But I don't expect that's going to happen much, except here and there at a state or local level.
Thank you.
Professor Pilar, I think that the Quincy Institute was involved with this coalition of progressive groups that have released a statement and tried to sort of create a progressive momentum for the Biden administration in terms of foreign policy, and called for changes in relation to our in regarding our relationship with Israel and other issues. So what is the prospect for lobbying for a more progressive foreign policy in the shorter or in the longer term, in terms of the groups that allied to make that statement?
Well, I don't have a crystal ball about that, Richard. I think probably enough things have gone wrong, and I've heard enough Americans over these last 3.5, coming up on 4 years, that one can hope that the larger reaction to that and reaction against that will speak well to the sort of progressive possibilities that you mentioned. So I'm mildly optimistic in that regard, but I hate to have to say that it's because of the suffering and the mistakes that have made that possible.
I also read a report last night that there is a large group of people warning the Biden campaign that his foreign policy team is not as progressive as it should be. A lot of the figures that are part of the foreign policy team of Biden campaign are the same type of people that in the past advocated intervention here and there. You know, people like Samantha Power and Michelle Flournoy and people like them. And according to what I read, they are collecting more and more signatures to warn Biden about the influence of this group of foreign policy experts on the foreign policy of his plausible administration in January. So one has to be very cautious about this. A lot of these people work with Hillary Clinton, for example, Nicholas Burns, for example, and people like that. And they were close to Hillary Clinton. And we know Hillary Clinton had, sort of hawkish view of foreign policy and, sort of liberal interventionist, so to speak. So we have to be cautious about this. We will see what happens. I'm not very hopeful, but anything at this moment is better than a Trump administration. That's for sure.
I've been reading the statements by Tony Blinken, who's sort of taking the lead on U.S. policy towards Israel, and basically he's willing to accept a lot of what the damage that Trump has done regarding moving the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, and they're anti-BDS, although they are saying that BDS has a right to exist or speak, under First Amendment rights. But I'm quite disappointed so far in what I'm hearing. I mean, it's not that I didn't expect this from Biden, because I think he's certainly not progressive in the sense that we would like to see regarding Israeli policy. But I just see a lot more stasis and the status quo with Biden regarding Israel policy, and that concerns me, because I think that we're seeing this countervailing tension and this rise of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, which is willing to be much more muscular in terms of criticizing Israel. And I know that's going to be a tension that's going to be playing out naturally politically in the next 4 or 8 years. But I see this sort of like these two power centers, at loggerheads with each other. And of course, which side I hope wins, but it's up in the air, I guess.
Well, we should be very clear. Biden is no Obama.
Yeah.
Obama was center, slightly left, ever so slightly left on these issues, both Israel and Russia. Biden is very much to the right of Obama on both Russia and Israel. So we shouldn't have any illusions that he's going to be in any way, shape, or form recreating somehow Obama's set of policies in either case.
I think if we had Joe Biden is here participating in this discussion, and if the discussion were off the record, I think he'd take some exception to what you just said, Gareth. And I think he'd talk to us about, limited political chits and getting things done, and limited bandwidth and getting things done. And how he, as president, is going to have to make these balancing decisions of where he uses political capital in one thing that he might need to accomplish something else, bearing in mind the huge hole that he has to dig the country out of on so many fronts, the public health front, the economic front, as well as the foreign policy front.
Here.
But digging a country out of an economic hole, the first part of that, no doubt, would be normalizing relations or paring back in terms of the aggressive stance that the US has taken towards China and towards other
What's going on?
that would be a very easy first step to take, I'd imagine.
Well, easy, except, you know, as a politician, then he's still going to have to contend with, you know, an overall anti-Chinese suspicion of growth of China sentiment. You know, however he analyzes things specifically himself. But you're quite right on the trade issue. You know, the Trump trade policy has caused significant economic damage to farm exports and a lot of other things. And yes, I think he could and probably will make the case that correcting that problem will help the larger economic situation.
Thank you. Adil Hamazia, you had a question you wanted to ask? If you want to take the floor. Sorry, I'll unmute you there.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for the insights, comments, thoughts, perspectives. I have a couple of, if you like, almost interrelated big picture thoughts, questions, and I'll arrive at a question. I find it fascinating that in 2 hours we haven't mentioned the word Europe once, which is interesting. We sort of spoke about China's sort of geoeconomic shifts vis-a-vis BRI and the recent Iran deal, whatever that looks like, whether it's short term, medium term, is consolidated in the near future, and what this does to countries like Pakistan when we think about Gwadar versus Chabahar, that sort of geoeconomics. But I'd be interested to sort of, since we're about to, I think we're wrapping up soon, I think Paul alluded to what next year could look like. But I know serious analysts don't do this, but I'd like you to sort of look into your crystal ball and give us a sort of almost scenario planning of where we would be with a Trump admin in 18 months' time versus a Biden administration. And what I'll throw into there for my Iranian colleagues is Khamenei is not 20 years old. He's not a spring chicken. So, you know, what does succession do to this discussion? And also, what does succession look like across the other side of the Gulf, right? So a few thoughts, you know, thinking US-China trade, US-Europe, and bringing it all together into a couple of, if you like, plausible scenarios and black swan scenarios would, I'm sure, end the evening on a high and keep us thinking. So thanks very much.
Adil, I'm grateful, but I'll ask you to throw in one clarifier to your request to put in a crystal ball. Yes. What would Ghislaine Maxwell have said about Trump in your scenario before you ask anyone to gaze into the future?
Sorry, are you suggesting that Ghislaine Maxwell will be alive in 18 months?
Oh boy.
No comments. I don't have an answer. We also didn't touch upon the sort of UN embargo in terms of more immediate issues in a few months' time. But I'd be grateful for scenarios, and you know we can check in on you guys in 18 months to see where things stand.
I'll push you over to Paul if I may. Thank you.
What was part of the question? If Trump is reelected, what do we see in 18 months?
Yes.
Well, we see more of the same. And I mean, you know, he's had a couple of interviews where he was tossed the softest of softball questions about what are your plans for a second term? And he couldn't come up with anything because he doesn't have anything. I mean, this is somebody who has absolutely no sense of grand strategy or strategy. It's all political tactics. So it would just be more of the same. And on these issues we've discussed, like with regard to relations to Iran, it would just be, you know, they would try to find some Iranian that they haven't sanctioned yet. And then Pompeo would get before the cameras and say, we've got more sanctions and this is more pressure and it's going to work. And that's just going to continue. And likewise with all the other issues that we've talked about, you know, on Israel, Palestine, well, I don't know where we'll be on the annexation front, but we certainly won't be any closer to anything that is any of us would call a road to peace. So just the short answer is more of the same.
And on the Biden front, if we were to get that for Christmas?
Well, I think to focus on our starting topic, Iran, we would have recompliance with the JCPOA. I think then, you know, difficult, perhaps prolonged negotiations would follow on follow-on issues. I think 18 months from now, those negotiations would still be very much in train. Look how long it took to negotiate the JCPOA. Certainly more than 18 months. On some of the other issues, I think most of you on this screen will be disappointed in the terms that Richard was just talking about in terms of Israel-related issues. You're right. He's already indicated he's not going to move the embassy back to Tel Aviv, things like that. Although there would be probably like a de-recognition of the Golan Heights, there might be some adjustment. I would hope that we'd have, maybe even if the embassy doesn't move, a reopening of a separate consulate general as the envoy to the Palestinians, like we used to have before the ambassador just took it all over. So little things like that. China, I think we would have a reversal of some of the worst aspects of the trade war, but we'd probably still be in ongoing negotiations with the Chinese on trade and economic issues. And we haven't talked about this, but strategic arms with the Russians, I think we would see a change there. I think we would see probably ongoing negotiations about what would come after the after START, which would be a definite change from the Trump administration.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? Great. Moji, I'll allow one or two more questions as I'm hoping to wrap up by past, if that's okay. But I'll unmute you there. Okay.
Thank you so much. I think it's quite important to understand that there is going back to what Dr. Mossadegh said while after the coup in 1953, he said internal despotism and external colonialism are two sides of the same coin. At that time, he was talking about the relationship between the Shah and Eisenhower and Nixon, whereby as unequal partners, as a master and slave, they needed each other directly, in the same way that bin Salman and Trump need each other directly as a master and slave. Now, what makes life for peace and democracy activists like me, Iranian Americans, very difficult is because in Iran's internal despotism, especially under Ayatollah Khamenei, needs Netanyahu and Trump as enemy. So internal despotism and external colonialism need one another in an interdependent way so that they reinforce each other. So to me, that understanding that dynamic that then informs the so-called hardliners in Iran to actually be nervous about Democrats to come to power. One of them told me in a moment of honesty, I said, why is it that you guys that are so-called anti-imperialist and anti-Israel and whatever, how is it that you love a hardline Republicans and Trump's? And he said he liked Trump's. He said, Moji, we, i.e. the hardliners, the theocrats in Iran, he said, we cannot match the soft power of the Democrats. And I'm quoting, we cannot match the soft power of the Democrats. Therefore, we prefer a brazen enemy. In other words, Ayatollah Khamenei needs an enemy. So this is why if Biden administration goes to a just diplomacy, it will disarm the most militant of the hardliners inside Iran, which then in turn would disarm the Israeli, the hardcore Zionist policy of Israel, which they need each other as enemy. We need to decouple that relationship. Comments, please.
Well, I want to just take this and talk a little bit about Israel, but if somebody else wants to come back to the main part of your question, that would be great. I think that's true in terms of Israeli internal politics as well. Israel is basically a national security state or a garrison state, and it needs enemies as well. It needs external enemies that instill fear in the population, and that's how the far-right government really stays in power. The added effect of that is that it forces, it prevents any resolution of any major domestic or foreign problems that Israel is facing. It doesn't have to compromise on any issues. It doesn't have to reach a resolution with the Palestinians, as long as it can keep that sort of level of fear and paranoia going. And it prevents any constructive resolution of the major ongoing fundamental problems that exist. And I'm sure you could probably say that internally regarding Iran as well, because I know Iran is facing, big problems of corruption and sort of the embeddedness of that sort of issue in terms of the structure domestically in Iran.
But doesn't this all just simply come from Henry Kissinger's vision of the world, really? Way back when, of just creating an interconnectedness and a set piece of relations of interconnectedness that would always lead to, a framework that causes an orientation towards hardliners on all sides of the camp, really. That is the framework for the international relations model. I think, unfortunately, it takes an effort across nations and a synchronized effort across nations to try and dissolve that, wouldn't you say?
Well, I would certainly agree with the premise of the original question. That is indeed the way, hardliners on one side play off hardliners on the other side. I think that dynamic has existed with regard to Iranian and American hardliners, and it also has existed with Israeli and Iranian hardliners. I think you're quite right.
Sorry, Gareth, I think you're muted there. I can see you speaking, but there's no sound coming. Bear with me. I don't know why you're muted.
Got it.
Oh, there you go. Oh, we lost you.
No, it's gone.
Okay, is that it?
Now you're back. You're back.
Thanks. Okay, I just wanted to say something about the Iranian side of this equation. I am not so convinced that Iran's policy has been governed by the notion or the dynamic that the Ayatollah himself or the supreme leader himself and his coterie of advisors feel that they need an external enemy. On the contrary, I think the history of their policy toward the United States from the end of the Iran-Iraq war on shows a high degree of readiness to negotiate with the United States when there was any chance of real substantive negotiations. And so I think that that's been far overblown. I'm not suggesting that there's nobody in the Iranian system who doesn't take advantage of it, but I don't think that those people who've been making Iranian foreign policy are such that they really need a foreign threat. At least thus far, they have not been in a situation where they have chosen to turn down any opportunity. They've created the opportunity, and it's been turned down by the United States, at least in a couple of key instances.
I agree with Gareth. Can I add a few words?
Of course.
I agree with Gareth. I think Ayatollah Khamenei has followed a very pragmatic foreign policy. I don't agree with the notion that he needs, hardliners in the United States as enemy in order to survive or continue his power. Remember, during the administration of Rafsanjani in 1990s, they tried to reestablish a relation with Iran. And when they had a contract out for development of a large major oil field in the Persian Gulf, even though the American company Conoco had not made the best bet, and in fact, a European company had won the bidding, the Rafsanjani administration awarded that grant, that contract to Conoco to go into Iran and develop the oil field with the hope that that would be a start of better relationship. But what Bill Clinton did was not only preventing Conoco from doing that, but also he was the first president who imposed a comprehensive set of sanctions on Iran in 1995. Then during the administration of Mohammad Khatami, Iran had extensive negotiations with the three European countries. And as I said earlier, that administration had actually agreed to limit the number of centrifuges in Iran to 3,000 at that stage. We should also remember that it was Khamenei that authorized the beginning of negotiations with Obama administration, which began in 2012 when Ahmadinejad was still the president, and the secret negotiations began in Oman with authorization of Ayatollah Khamenei. So I would not go along with the notions that they need an external enemy. Of course, any politician that is clever enough would take advantage of the situation as they arise in order to use it for his own interests and the interests of his supporters. But I would say that the foreign policy that Iran has followed over the past at least 30 years, perhaps with the exception of some of the things that Ahmadinejad had said, has been very pragmatic, and they wanted to actually have a rapprochement with the United States. It has been the United States, and in particular, the influence of Saudi Arabia and Israel in the United States, as well as neocons, that have prevented that. It is because of that. Otherwise, Iranians have always wanted to have a better relationship with the United States. Iranians, in fact, like the United States. Everybody wants to come to the United States. Everybody wants to send their children to the United States. A lot of people who are in government right now got their education in the United States. Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif is an American educated diplomat, and a lot of other people. So it has been the United States that hasn't wanted to have a better relationship with Iran, at least less tension, more constructive engagement, more extensive commercial relation, and so on.
Just a quick comment. I don't think there's really a contradiction between the observations that were just made about actual Iranian policy at the highest levels and the premise of Mr. Aga's question about how hardline ways of thinking tend to play off against hardline ways of thinking in an adversary country. And if you look at how the Supreme Leader has handled the JCPOA issue, you're quite right. He gave slack initially to Ahmadinejad, then to Rouhani and Zarif to conduct the negotiation, but publicly, he left himself enough wiggle room, expressing a lot of skepticism. And then after the Trump administration did what it did, he said, "I told you so." It was a mistake to trust too much negotiations with those perfidious Americans, which I think is partly his kind of required nod to the hardline way of thinking. So I don't think there's a real contradiction.
Well put.
I think there were a couple more questions. One from, was it Nasli? Nasli, would you like to pose a question?
Yes, this is Amir Buzari, using my daughter's computer, Nasli. We're all watching everything, and I appreciate all the comments and the event. It's very, very, very sought after event. My question is regarding Secretary Pompeo's intent to circulate another draft on the ban of sale of conventional arms at the United Nations Security Council next week. The first one didn't go that far because apparently a whole variety of opinions, sometimes conflicting opinions, arose in the United Nations Security Council. But referring to Adel's comments about the role of the European governments in this regard, I would appreciate if any of the panelists would say a word about what they anticipate the European government's reaction be to a more aggressive draft resolution that Pompeo is going to circulate next week.
I think the administration is putting forward that resolution in the realization that it's going to get vetoed. And they're just doing this as a preliminary step before they take step 2, which is to try to invoke the snapback provisions while claiming that they are still participants in the agreement. And every other member of the Security Council thinks that's absurd. But I don't think there's any expectation on the part of Pompeo that this resolution on the arms embargo is going to go anywhere. They're just going through the motions to get to their ploy about the snapback.
It's a lot of hocus pocus.
Okay, I think on that note, I'll invoke my host privilege and ask the elephant in the room, what does anyone think today about what has happened in Beirut yesterday with respect to how that impacts on the regional balance of power and issues that are raised through that?
I may be throwing a bomb into this, but I wanted to talk about my sort of contribution to the issue. And that is that as part of my reporting that I do from Israel on national security issues, and the sources that I have in Israel dealing with the subject, I have received information indirectly from an Israeli official that that there was an attack on Beirut, as Trump did say after being briefed by his generals, as he called them, that Israel had intended, as it has done in the Bekaa and in Syria, to attack a Hezbollah arms cache in the port, and that it had intended just to destroy that depot, and instead, for some reason I don't understand, given Israel's intelligence capabilities, they did not realize that nearby there was this fertilizer warehouse. And so the first set of explosions was from this Hezbollah warehouse, and it caught fire and exploded the other warehouse that actually did the lion's share of the damage in Beirut. Of course, this is a very complicated issue and story. And many people are skeptical about it, and I understand that. But I feel that my source is incredibly credible and has reported scores, if not hundreds, of stories that were broken, that were either under censorship or gag order in Israel. So I know there are other issues to talk about in terms of what happened in Beirut, but I wanted to throw that into the mix.
I'm grateful for that. Did your source explain the method of delivery for?
Well, I often, when I do these sorts of stories, I have to do a lot of my own sort of not speculation, but putting together the pieces of a puzzle. So I wasn't given that information by the source, who was circumspect and only told me, what I basically told you. But I certainly would disagree with anyone who claimed that Israel would have used an air attack to do this, either a drone or a jet plane, because Israel is willing to use that kind of armament in the Bekaa or in Syria because it's unrestrained. But it was a considerable escalation just to attack even the Hezbollah warehouse in Beirut, because Israel, not since the last war in Lebanon, hasn't done such a thing. So I would think that it would have followed something like what it did in Natanz, where either an explosive device or some sort of cyber attack inside the Natanz facility ended up destroying it. And that would mean that either there would have been an explosive device put into the warehouse, or somehow there was something that was introduced into the Hezbollah depot that caused that explosion. But I'm kind of just speculating there.
Sorry, Tasnim, could I come in?
Yes.
So, Richard, with all due respect, I mean, could you say a little bit more about the evidence? It does seem like you maybe went ahead and wrote the article a little bit too quick and possibly rowing backwards right now, because I don't know where the evidence came from. Is it possible that maybe you were given false information to maybe put you in a sticky position, or question mark?
I've been doing this for nearly 15 years, and in the past, well in the past, I was deliberately fed mistaken information on one or two stories. But the source that I have is has never misled me, and has reported many stories that were equally sort of incendiary in terms of, you know, Israel doing a commando raid in Gaza that ended up getting a commander of the elite Israeli Special Forces unit killed, and Hamas in return put up pictures of all of these commandos. So that is just one example of maybe, you know, 100 or 200 stories like that. So I'm not backing down, as you said, from anything that I said. I'm really basically trying to understand how this could have happened beyond the specific information that I've been given. And so far, no one has, people are disputing various aspects of this scenario, but I haven't heard anybody able to, you know, discredit this. And I actually did speak to a Lebanese journalist last night and asked him about the possibility that Hezbollah did maintain an arms depot in the port, and he said, yes, there certainly is a Hezbollah presence in the port and in the airport, and that's just one little piece I'm trying to put together to verify aspects of this report. But so far, I have not heard any glaring contradiction that would lead me to back away.
However, this explosion and tragedy took place, it is difficult to tease out the reasons behind it from a consequence. But I mean, Lebanon was at the point of economic collapse anyway. We now have a humanitarian catastrophe looming from the loss of its port. Do you think, in a perverse way, that this has maybe put Lebanon in a better position to get economic help now than it was in before?
Well, I think it's more likely that if any help came, it would be from within the Arab world, you know, maybe Saudi Arabia. But relations between Saudi Arabia and all of these other countries are so kind of fraught with tension and conflict. I'm not sure that bin Salman is willing to step up. And yes, I think there's going to be a lot more humanitarian relief and willingness of states to try to help ameliorate the situation. But I think you've got this fundamental dysfunction inside of Lebanon, and I don't think from the outside much beyond, you know, sending shipments of relief, and I don't think that the world can solve Lebanon's problems. And if I can return to Israel, Israel has a history of exacerbating all of the natural internal ethnic and religious conflicts within Lebanon for its own benefit. And if we want to talk about the reasons why Israel would have done what it did, there's been a great deal of tension on the northern border. There was a claim that Hezbollah had tried to infiltrate a commando unit into Israel, and then Hezbollah denied it. And then Netanyahu and Benny Gantz were saying that if Hezbollah does dare to think that it's going to do something like that, we will, you know, send it back to the Stone Age. So I think that an attack on Hezbollah in Beirut would have been a message from Netanyahu saying, we're not going to stand for any attempt to infiltrate or cause conflict on the northern border. And this would have been in line with those kind of bellicose threats that Israel is known for.
This also fits into a larger sort of strategy of Israel to make it look like both Iran and Hezbollah are extremely vulnerable and weak. And so from that point of view, my immediate reaction was to suspect an Israeli hand in it. I haven't ruled it out yet. And I think that what we have to do is to verify or to negate the story that there was a fireworks factory or fireworks warehouse nearby that caught fire. That, if that turns out to be true, that would be a problem for, I think, the narrative of an Israeli attack. If it turns out to be untrue, then I think all bets are off, and I'm back to the story of, I mean, I would be much more inclined to pursue the story of Israeli attack.
I just thought of something else that's important as sort of evidence or support for what I've been talking about, and that is that Robert Baer, who's also, I'm sure Professor Pilar would know him, and writes for The Nation and was a CIA official in the past. He has said that he believes that the first explosion, which many people have called fireworks, he's called a munitions explosion. And that would tend to buttress some of the statements that I've been making based on this Israeli source. And I don't know where, I mean, he's looking at videos and that's where his supposition is coming from. But I think given his background, I think that's something that we need to look at with seriousness.
Thank you. Moji, would you like to come in with the last question if I can?
Thank you. It's actually a comment on this. My own speculation, and based on the readings that I've done, is that this, I call it an attack on Lebanon. It fits in the pattern of US and Israel, or Trump administration in its waning months, trying to provoke Iran's supreme leader and the Revolutionary Guards into some kind of a reaction. So you have the attack on Natanz, my hometown, by the way, and other attacks inside Iran and in Syria and in Lebanon, trying to, while they have time, while Trump is still in the White House, and giving him an excuse for some kind of an October surprise. I think it's very difficult to see that it was just an explosion of a munition dump in the port of Beirut. And I believe that that would be something that at least I would be digging. I would invite Mr. Silverstein to dig deeper in that particular angle.
Forgive me for being slightly dense, but why would Hezbollah not want to blame Israel if there is a cogent argument for an Israeli attack, if I may?
I can answer that one, and that is that the Hezbollah position is very, very similar to, parallel with the Iranian position, which was to essentially deny that there was any real evidence of an external attack after the the fire in the explosion and fire at Natanz, and a similar, not a similar, but another fire in an area which was part of the Parchin military reserve. And Hezbollah has thus far simply denied that there's any indication or any reason to believe that there was an attack. And this is part of a broader strategy to try to deny what the Israelis are doing, which, as I mentioned earlier, was to make the case within Iran and within Lebanon that that their foes are weak and vulnerable, which has been a neoconservative and Israeli strategy for many, many years now.
I think we also have to look at Hezbollah's position right now inside Lebanon, and it's often, because it's a key player in the government, it's blamed for a lot of the economic dysfunction and the sort of dissolution that's happening in Lebanese society. So for Hezbollah to admit that the weapons depot in the port, which nobody except Hezbollah really probably knew was there, and maybe U.S. intelligence and Israeli intelligence, and say not only did we have this munitions dump in the port, but we were indirectly responsible for the destruction of most of the city of Beirut, would be just really untenable for Hezbollah. I think they can't afford to, they might like to blame Israel because they do that when a lower key kind of event happens. But this is just too massive damage for them to be willing to take that direction.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful on behalf of Global Perspectives Forum for all of your contributions, particularly you, Richard, for bringing such an esteemed group together, and your patience in all of this, particularly with our little interruptions from the less intellectuals.
That added to the fun.
Well, one day one hopes that we can do this from Austria, where some of their symbolism might get them into a bit more trouble than here, really. But again, I'll close off with a big thanks to Richard Silverstein for helping put this together, Paul Pillar, Gareth Porter, and Mohammed Sahimi. Professor, again, I'm grateful to you. And all the questions, cogent as they were, asked and intelligent and focused, and I'm grateful for that also. I will post up the recording and send it to you, Richard, as well, if I may, through a YouTube link in due course. And I hope you can disseminate it to all others. And I'll post it on the Twitter group as well, so that everyone can have access to that. Once again, thank you so much for your time, particularly during this period. And
thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.